For months, she fed a crippled stranger in silence, never asking his name. But on a rainy day, he whispered 3 words that changed her life forever. "I'm a billionaire." Every afternoon around 1 p.m., Mary Jensen stepped outside her quiet rental home on Maple Street, carrying a warm lunchbox. It always had something simple: mac and cheese, chicken salad, or meatloaf, whatever she could stretch from her groceries that week. She wasn't rich. In fact, she barely made it from paycheck to paycheck, working double shifts as a cleaner in the city hospital. But every day, like clockwork, she walked a block and a half to the bench by the old oak tree near the bus stop, where a man named Elijah sat with a worn cap pulled low and a pair of crutches leaning beside him. Elijah never asked for food. He never even looked people in the eye. But Mary noticed how he would shift uncomfortably when others passed, as if shrinking from judgment. His pants were always frayed, shoes unevenly worn, and one leg bent stiffly beneath him. The first day she brought him food, he had hesitated, staring at her hand like it was a trick. But hunger won, and so did her smile. From that day forward, Mary made sure Elijah ate something homemade, something warm. She never asked who he was or why he sat alone, and Elijah never offered an explanation. Not yet. Maple Street was the kind of place where everyone noticed everything. So when a woman like Mary, single, overworked, and barely surviving, started feeding a beggar every day, tongues began to wag. The neighbors whispered about her kindness in one breath and her foolishness in the next. "She's being used," said old Mr. Harris across the street, shaking his head. "That man's probably a junkie." "She's always been soft," another neighbor muttered from her porch. "She thinks she's saving the world." But Mary never cared for opinions. She had learned long ago that people judged what they didn't understand. She didn't feed Elijah because he was grateful, though he always said thank you in a soft, husky voice. She fed him because she knew what hunger felt like. Real hunger. The kind that hollows your stomach and breaks your pride. As autumn rolled in, the bench beneath the oak became their silent meeting point. She would sit for a moment after handing him the lunch, sipping her coffee while he ate. They didn't talk much, just nods, the occasional chuckle. But something passed between them each day that no words could hold: dignity. And beneath Elijah's ragged beard and tired posture, something stirred. One Thursday afternoon, rain trickled lightly from a pale sky. Mary arrived in a thin poncho, soaked to the bone, but still holding a container of beef stew. Elijah, already drenched, looked up in surprise. "You didn't have to come today," he mumbled. "I know," Mary replied, setting the container beside him. "But you didn't stop being hungry because it rained." That was the first time he smiled, really smiled. It wasn't a perfect smile. His teeth were crooked, and the lines on his face made him look older than his years, but it was genuine. He took the stew with trembling hands and whispered, "You're the only one who sees me." Mary's throat tightened. She gave a small nod, blinked the rain from her eyes, and turned to leave. Behind her, Elijah sat straighter than usual. That small moment cracked something open in him. For months, he had let the world pass him by. But that woman, just one woman with a lunchbox and compassion, was beginning to change everything. And though she didn't know it yet, Mary wasn't just feeding a beggar. She was feeding a man who once owned the very buildings she scrubbed clean at night. Before Elijah became a shadow on a park bench, he was Elijah Darnell, the same name that once headlined tech magazines as the youngest software billionaire of his time. He had been tall, confident, with a tailored life carved out of ambition and calculated risk. But wealth didn't protect him from betrayal or the slow decay of trust. It began with an accident. A car crash that left his left leg twisted and one eye fogged with trauma. As he recovered in a private clinic, his CFO embezzled millions, his board voted him out, and even his longtime fiancée married his rival. By the time he was discharged, Elijah had nothing. No money, no home, no friends. But Elijah had always been a strategist. He chose silence, disguised his identity. He wanted to know if anyone in the world could see him beyond the broken body, the unwashed clothes, the limp. And in months of being ignored, scorned, and invisible, only Mary had looked him in the eyes and seen a man. He didn't want pity. He wanted proof that kindness still existed without a camera, without an angle. And day after day, Mary offered him that truth, without asking for anything in return. Mary's second job took place behind white walls and the smell of disinfectant. Scrubbing floors at St. Martin's General Hospital was far from glamorous, but it paid enough to keep her lights on. One late evening, as she pushed her mop down the third-floor hallway, she noticed a figure moving unsteadily near the emergency exit. Her heart paused. It was Elijah. His usual bench had been empty that day. Now here he was, wincing as he leaned on his crutches, his soaked coat clinging to his frail frame. "I didn't know where else to go," he whispered. "My leg. It's worse." Without hesitation, Mary guided him to the ER entrance, fetched a nurse, and sat with him through the paperwork. When they asked if she was family, she said yes, without blinking. It wasn't a lie, not in spirit. The doctors ran tests. Elijah's infection had worsened. He needed surgery. He gripped Mary's hand and muttered, "Thank you for not leaving me." She simply smiled and said, "That's what people do when they care." After Elijah's surgery, he stayed in the hospital for over a week. Each morning, Mary brought his favorite oatmeal cookies and sat beside him. They talked more now. He asked about her late parents, her failed marriage, the brother she hadn't seen in years. And slowly, she noticed how his eyes weren't just tired. They were watchful, calculating, like someone who'd lived many lives. One afternoon, Mary forgot her scarf on the hospital chair. When she returned to retrieve it, Elijah was asleep, but his bedside drawer was slightly ajar. Inside, tucked between tissues and receipts, was a leather envelope marked with a corporate seal, Darnell Innovations. Mary froze. That name was familiar, very familiar. Years ago, it had been in every headline. She didn't open the envelope. She didn't touch it, but she couldn't stop thinking about it. That evening, she Googled Elijah Darnell on her cracked phone. Photos of a younger, cleaner man popped up. Suits, red carpets, tech expos. The resemblance was undeniable, and suddenly, the pieces began to fit like shards of a forgotten mirror. After Elijah's surgery, he stayed in the hospital for over a week. Each morning, Mary brought his favorite oatmeal cookies and sat beside him. They talked more now. He asked about her late parents, her failed marriage, the brother she hadn't seen in years. And slowly, she noticed how his eyes weren't just tired. They were watchful, calculating, like someone who'd lived many lives. One afternoon, Mary forgot her scarf on the hospital chair. When she returned to retrieve it, Elijah was asleep, but his bedside drawer was slightly ajar. Inside, tucked between tissues and receipts, was a leather envelope marked with a corporate seal. Darnell Innovations? Mary froze. That name was familiar. Very familiar. Years ago, it had been in every headline. She didn't open the envelope. She didn't touch it, but she couldn't stop thinking about it. That evening, she Googled Elijah Darnell on her cracked phone. Photos of a younger, cleaner man popped up. Suits, red carpets, tech expos. The resemblance was undeniable. And suddenly, the pieces began to fit like shards of a forgotten mirror. The next morning, Mary arrived at the hospital early. Elijah was already awake, staring at the ceiling with unreadable eyes. She didn't mention the envelope. She didn't need to. "You already know, don't you?" Elijah asked softly, not looking at her. Mary nodded slowly. Not everything, but enough. There was no anger in her voice, just quiet understanding. Elijah sighed. "I lost everything. The money, the power, the people who swore they loved me. I wanted to know if someone would still treat me like a man when I had nothing left." Mary's voice was gentle. "You didn't lose everything. You still had your soul." Elijah chuckled bitterly. "That and a bum leg." She leaned forward. "You had dignity and trust. And now you've got a friend." Elijah blinked rapidly, fighting the warmth that surged in his chest. No one had spoken to him like that in years. No one had looked past his failures with such grace. 3 days later, a sleek black SUV pulled into the hospital parking lot. A tall man in a navy suit stepped out and walked straight to Elijah's room with a briefcase in hand. Mary, confused, watched from the hallway. Inside the room, Elijah accepted the briefcase and nodded. "You followed my instructions?" "Yes, sir," the man replied. "The new board has been briefed, the shares have been restored, and your residence is ready." Elijah's expression didn't change. "What about the shelter renovation?" "In progress, fully funded." "Good. And the hospital bills?" "Covered." In her name, Elijah glanced at the window. Mary's reflection was faintly visible in the glass. He smiled. "I'll be leaving soon," he said, but not without thanking the woman who had fed his body and healed his soul. A week after Elijah was discharged, Mary returned to the same bench under the old oak tree, this time alone. In her hands was a lunchbox filled with his favorite tuna sandwich and an extra cookie, just in case. It felt odd sitting there, the space beside her empty, the crutches gone. She missed his presence more than she expected. His silence had become part of her routine. His quiet gratitude, his slow chewing, even the way he looked down when she spoke about hope. But now, he had vanished from the street just as quietly as he'd come. That night, she left the lunchbox on the bench and walked away, unsure if he'd ever come back. But before she turned the corner, a sleek black car pulled up beside the park curb. The window rolled down slowly, and Elijah, clean-shaven, dressed in a tailored suit, smiled at her. Mary stopped mid-step. "I owe you a real meal," he said gently. "And the truth." Elijah invited her to a rooftop restaurant overlooking the city skyline. Mary came in her best thrift store dress, feeling out of place amid chandeliers and crystal glasses. Yet, as Elijah pulled out her chair and handed her a menu, she noticed something familiar in his posture: humility. They ate slowly. They talked like old friends. He shared how he built his empire, how quickly it crumbled, and how solitude stripped him down to the man he truly was. She listened, not like a fan or a follower, but like someone who already knew him even before the confession. Elijah reached into his blazer and placed a check on the table. It was addressed to her. The amount? Enough to clear her debts, buy a home, and live comfortably for the rest of her life. Mary froze. "I don't want your money," she said quietly. "It's not payment," Elijah replied. "It's gratitude." Tears welled in her eyes, not from greed, but from the weight of being seen. A month later, the city woke to a headline that shocked the business world. Billionaire Elijah Darnell returns from the dead with a mission to fight poverty. Photos of him emerged, walking through food banks, shelter kitchens, even holding hands with children in rehab centers. But buried in the corner of a local newspaper was a different kind of photo. Elijah standing beside Mary outside a community center they'd opened together, smiling in plain clothes, surrounded by families. When asked by reporters why he chose to return with such humility, Elijah simply said, "I lost everything money could buy, but found what money could never earn." And beside him, Mary didn't need applause. Her reward had already come in the quiet redemption of a man she once fed without question. 6 months had passed since Elijah's return, and the neighborhood on Maple Street had changed, not with noise or drama, but with dignity. On the same street where Mary once struggled to pay rent, a brand new brick home now stood, modest but warm. And in its living room, Mary sat by the window, sipping tea, watching the old bench beneath the oak tree sway in the breeze. The house was in her name. No strings, no catch. Elijah had insisted. He never moved far. Just 2 streets over, he purchased an old duplex and converted it into a halfway home for struggling veterans and the disabled. Every evening, he came by with groceries or a smile, sometimes just to sit and watch the sky with her in silence. Mary never asked for anything. She had already received what most never do, proof that good deeds return, even if delayed by time and disguise. And Elijah, he had found peace, not in reclaiming his empire, but in building something slower, something real. It was raining on the day Mary met the girl. She was about 17, clothes soaked, her arms clinging to a battered school bag. She sat alone near the bench, shivering beneath a torn plastic bag. Mary crossed the street, carrying a spare umbrella, the same one she had once used during a storm when she first fed Elijah. Without a word, she handed the girl the umbrella and a sandwich. The girl blinked up at her, hesitant. "Why?" Mary smiled softly. "Because you look like someone who needs to believe people still care." The girl nodded, her eyes wide with surprise. Across the road, Elijah watched from his car. He didn't interrupt. He didn't need to. The torch of compassion had already been passed. Later that evening, Elijah said to her, "You didn't just feed me food. You fed me back into humanity." And Mary, without looking up, whispered, "You gave me something too. Proof that broken people still matter." Years passed. The world moved on. Darnell Innovations took a quieter direction, focused more on humanity than headlines. Elijah refused interviews. Mary declined awards. But their story lived in the hearts of everyone who knew what the bench under the oak tree once meant. Children were told tales about the woman who gave without knowing and the man who received without revealing. The bench was never removed. Instead, a bronze plaque was installed that read, "Kindness sees what wealth cannot." On Sunday afternoons, Elijah and Mary, now older, wiser, would sit on that bench again, watching strangers pass by. Some stopped to ask about the plaque. Some sat quietly, lost in their own thoughts. But one thing never changed. Each day, someone left a warm meal on that bench, not out of charity, but out of remembrance, of a woman who gave without expecting, and a billionaire who finally remembered what it meant to be seen.